witness this. A fisherman stood knee-deep in the shallows off Komoda Beach, hauling nets he'd hauled 1,000 times before, when he looked up and saw the horizon had vanished. Where the sea should have met the sky, there was only wood. Masts packed so tight, they looked like a forest that had grown overnight from the water itself. 900 ships. He dropped his nets. He didn't retrieve them. He ran up the beach screaming words that made no sense to anyone who heard them, because the words themselves were impossible. "The sea is gone," he said. "There's nothing but ships." That was October 5th, 1274. The morning the largest naval invasion force East Asia had ever assembled appeared off the coast of an island that had never mattered to anyone. Tsushima. A fishing rock. A way station for traders who couldn't afford better routes, and 700 square kilometers of hills and trees, and people who had lived their entire lives at the edge of empire, at the edge of attention, at the edge of history. In one sunrise, they became the center of everything. The man who received the fisherman's report was named Sō Sukekuni, and he was 60 years old, and his knees ached when he stood too fast, and he hadn't commanded men in real combat in longer than some of his soldiers had been alive. He had perhaps 2 hours to become a general. He had perhaps 300 men to stop an army. He had no illusions about how this would end. He armored up anyway. He mounted his horse. He rode toward the beach. This wasn't a battle. This was an audition for extinction, and Sukekuni was the only actor who showed up. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy the hidden truths of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. To understand the scale of what was coming for Sō Sukekuni, you have to understand what had just appeared on his horizon. Not ships, not soldiers, a machine. The most efficient conquest engine the world had ever produced, and it had been running for 60 years without a single significant defeat. The Mongol Empire in 1274 stretched from Korea to Hungary, from the frozen edges of Siberia to the jungles of Vietnam. 24 million square kilometers. 1 in every 4 human beings on the planet lived under its control or its shadow. And the man who ran it, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, had just decided that Japan was next. Not because he needed it. The empire was already larger than Rome at its peak, and larger than Alexander ever dreamed. Kublai Khan wanted Japan because Japan had insulted him. Twice he'd sent letters demanding submission. Twice the Japanese court hadn't even bothered to reply. They'd read his threats, shrugged, and gone back to their poetry contests and their temple politics and their comfortable assumption that the sea would protect them from anything the continent could produce. They were wrong. The sea wasn't a wall. It was a road. And Kublai Khan had just built the vehicles to drive it. The fleet anchoring off Tsushima that morning carried somewhere between 25 and 40,000 men, depending on which source you trust. Let's be conservative. Let's say 30,000. 15,000 Mongol and Chinese soldiers, 8,000 Korean soldiers, 7,000 Korean sailors, 900 ships, almost all of them built in Korean shipyards in under a year, because when the Mongol Empire told you to build a navy, you built a navy, or you stopped existing. So Sukekuni, riding toward Komoda Beach with the morning sun behind him, had 80 mounted samurai. If you counted every servant, every retainer, every farmer's son handed a spear and told to follow, he might have had 300 men total. Do the math. 10 to 1 at minimum, possibly 100 to 1 if you measured what actually mattered. Coordinated troops, siege weapons, combat experience against enemies who weren't playing by the same rules. Because here's the thing about samurai warfare in 1274 that nobody explains properly. The samurai weren't soldiers, not the way we understand the word. They were landlords with swords, regional strongmen who settled disputes through ritualized combat that looked more like a tournament than a war. A samurai rode forward, announced his name and lineage, waited for an enemy champion to answer, and then they fought while everyone watched. Glory came from individual achievement, witnessed and recorded, something you could brag about later, something that got you promoted. This system worked beautifully against other samurai. It had never been tested against anyone else. It had certainly never been tested against an empire that had spent 6 decades perfecting the art of killing people who thought war had rules. The Mongols didn't duel. They processed. Their armies moved in coordinated units, communicating through flags and drums, executing maneuvers that European and Asian commanders alike had never seen and couldn't counter. Horse archers would circle at distance, firing in waves, softening the enemy line until it started to crack. Then heavy cavalry would crash through the gap. Then infantry would mop up whatever was left. No names, no glory, no witnesses who survived to tell the story any differently than the Mongols wanted it told. Sukekuni didn't know any of this. He couldn't know it. Japan had been isolated from continental warfare for centuries, fighting itself in elegant, ritualized patterns that had nothing to do with what was about to hit him. He'd heard rumors, maybe. Trader stories about cities erased, about pyramids of skulls, about an enemy that offered only 2 options: surrender and serve, or cease to exist. But rumors are abstractions, and the ships on his horizon were real. What did he see that morning as he crested the ridge above Komoda Beach? Boats in the shallows, disgorging men. Hundreds of soldiers already on the sand, forming up. More coming every minute. Banners he didn't recognize, in colors that meant nothing to him. And drums. The Mongol war drums had already started, a low pulse that would continue for hours, designed to disorient, to exhaust, to make you feel like you were fighting inside someone else's heartbeat. His son was beside him, also armored, also doomed. Neither of them said so. A retainer leaned close with a question that was really a plea. Should we send for reinforcements from the mainland? Sukekuni's answer came fast, because he'd already done the calculation. By the time they arrive, there won't be anyone left to reinforce. He didn't say what came next in his head, the part a general never says out loud. The part about how reinforcements weren't going to change the math anyway. How the best thing Tsushima could do now was die loudly enough that someone on the mainland might have time to prepare. The part about how his entire life, his family, his island, everything he'd ever built or protected or loved, was now a speed bump in someone else's war. He said none of that. He drew his sword. He gave the order to advance. What happened next would take less than 2 hours. 8 decades of samurai tradition would shatter in a single morning. And Sō Sukekuni would die without ever understanding why nothing he'd learned about war had prepared him for this. The charge began the way every samurai charge began. Formal approach, measured pace. A champion riding forward from the Japanese line, shouting his name across the beach, announcing his lineage, issuing the challenge that custom required, waiting for an opponent to answer, waiting for the duel that would start the battle properly, honorably. The way war was supposed to work, the Mongol line did not stop. No one answered. The drums just kept pounding, steady and mechanical, and then came the arrows. Not 1 arrow, not a dozen, hundreds. A coordinated volley fired on command, darkening the air, turning the sky into something that moved. The champion fell before he finished speaking. His horse collapsed under him, screaming, kicking, dying, and the Japanese line staggered backward because this wasn't combat. This wasn't anything they had a word for. This was industrial production applied to killing. Then the first bomb landed. Tetsuhao, the Japanese would later call them. Iron shells packed with gunpowder and metal fragments launched by catapult, designed to explode on impact. The samurai of 1274 had never seen an explosion, had never heard one. The noise alone shattered formations, sent horses into panic, left men standing frozen because their brains couldn't process what their eyes were showing them. Smoke, thunder, earth that jumped, and through all of it, the drums never stopped. Sukekuni kept moving forward. His banner was still up. Men were dying around him in ways he couldn't explain, cut down by arrows they never saw coming, killed by fire that fell from the sky, and he had no plan now except forward, because forward was the only direction that still made sense when everything else had failed. He never reached the Mongol line, or maybe he did, and it didn't matter. The historical record goes silent on the specifics of his death, which tells you something about how total the defeat was. No witnesses survived to describe it. No poets commemorated the moment. So Sukekuni entered history for one morning and left it by noon, and his body was never recovered, and the only thing we know for certain is that he didn't run. His son died somewhere on that beach too. We don't know where. We don't know how. We know only that he was there, and then he wasn't, and the Mongol army rolled over Tsushima like a wave over a sandcastle. By nightfall, the island was silent. The garrison had been annihilated. Civilians who hadn't fled into the mountains were being processed in ways that would become propaganda on the mainland for years afterward. Women with holes bored through their palms, strung on ropes, hung from the sides of ships as trophies. True or exaggerated, the stories would spread faster than any messenger, carried by survivors who'd seen enough to make the embellishments believable. The Mongols hadn't come to conquer Tsushima. They'd come to film a trailer. And Sō Sukekuni, dying on a beach he couldn't hold, had just become the opening scene. But here's the question. Nobody asks about Tsushima. The question that matters more than the body count, or the tactics, or the technological gap that made the whole thing so obscenely one-sided. Why? Why did Sukekuni charge? He knew the math. He knew reinforcements wouldn't arrive in time. He knew that retreat into the mountains might buy days, might save some of his people. It might give him a chance to fight a guerrilla campaign that could actually cost the enemy something. He knew all of this, and he chose the beach anyway. The answer isn't honor, though honor was part of it. The answer isn't stupidity, though historians who've never faced an impossible choice love to call it that. The answer is simpler and more human than either. He chose the beach because someone had to, because the ships were there and the enemy was landing, and the only alternative to fighting was watching. Because Sō Sukekuni had spent his entire life as the man responsible for this island, and when the island needed a body between itself and annihilation, there was no version of himself that could provide anything else. That's not strategy. That's not tactics. That's the thing that happens when a man looks at the math, accepts the math, and decides that the math doesn't get to dictate the terms of his death. He bought 2 hours, maybe less. It wasn't enough to change anything about the invasion's outcome. It wasn't enough to slow the Mongol timetable by a single day. But it was enough to die standing up. And sometimes, that's the only victory available. The Mongol fleet didn't linger. Within days, They'd moved on to the next island, Iki, where another deputy governor would make the same impossible choice and meet the same inevitable end. And then they'd sail for the mainland, for Hakata Bay, where the real prize waited. Tsushima was already forgotten. A footnote, a warm-up exercise. The empire that had swallowed continents didn't pause to memorialize the insects it crushed along the way. But Sō Sukekuni's death was already traveling faster than any ship. Fishermen who'd fled, servants who'd hidden, survivors who'd seen enough to describe the drums, the arrows, the bombs that fell from the sky, the enemy that didn't answer challenges because challenges were a courtesy extended to humans, and the Mongols had stopped seeing their opponents as human a long time ago. The warning reached the mainland before the fleet did, and the mainland, for the first time in its history, started to understand what was coming. But to understand how Japan had blundered into this moment, how an entire civilization had managed to ignore the largest empire in human history until that empire showed up on its beaches, you have to understand what was happening across the sea. You have to understand Korea and what the Mongols had done to it, and why the ships that killed Sukekuni were built by the same people they'd already conquered once. You have to understand Kim Bang-gyeong, the Korean general standing on the deck of the lead ship, watching Tsushima burn. A man who had survived genocide and was now conducting one for his conquerors, because the invasion of Japan wasn't a Mongol invasion. Not really. It was a Korean invasion, paid for with Korean labor, sailed on Korean ships, commanded by Korean officers under Mongol orders, and Kim Bang-gyeong knew exactly what he was doing. He'd seen it done to his own people first. The story you've heard about the Mongol Empire goes something like this. Savage horsemen from the steppes, brutal and primitive, sweeping across civilizations they couldn't understand and destroying everything they touched. Genghis Khan as a barbarian warlord, his grandsons as inheritors of chaos, an empire built on blood and terror and nothing else. It's a comforting story. It lets you believe that civilization lost to savagery, that the cultured peoples of Asia and Europe were simply overwhelmed by numbers and ferocity, that there was something aberrant about the Mongol conquests, something that couldn't happen again because it shouldn't have happened at all. The problem is that it's completely wrong. The Mongol Empire wasn't built by barbarians. It was built by geniuses. Military geniuses, administrative geniuses, logistical geniuses who solved problems that other civilizations hadn't even recognized as problems. The horror they inflicted wasn't mindless. It was calculated. Every massacre served a purpose. Every city burned was a city that had been offered the chance to surrender first. The Mongols didn't destroy civilization. They built one of the most sophisticated governmental systems the medieval world had ever seen, and they did it while killing somewhere between 30 and 40 million people. That's the adult version. That's the version that explains why, by 1274, no power on Earth had successfully resisted them for more than a few years. And that's the version that makes Sō Sukekuni's death something other than a footnote. To understand the empire that appeared on Tsushima's horizon, you have to understand how it moved. Not the cavalry charges and the arrow storms, but the infrastructure underneath, the roads. The Mongols inherited the world's oldest postal system from the Chinese and expanded it into something unprecedented on the Yam network. Relay stations positioned every 25 to 30 miles across the entire empire, staffed with fresh horses, supplied with food and water, manned by riders who existed for one purpose: to carry information faster than anyone thought possible. A message could travel from the Korean peninsula to Kublai Khan's court in Khanbalik in under 2 weeks. Orders could flow back just as fast. This meant that when the invasion fleet launched from Korea in October 1274, Kublai Khan already knew the wind conditions, the troop readiness, the supply situation, the political complications with his Korean vassals. He knew which commanders were reliable and which ones needed watching. He knew how many arrows had been produced, how many ships had been completed, how many horses had survived the summer. He was 1,500 miles away, and he was running the operation in something approaching real time. Sō Sukekuni, by contrast, learned about the invasion when a fisherman ran screaming up a beach. That's the gap. Not technology, not numbers, not even tactics. Information. The Mongols knew everything about everyone, and everyone knew almost nothing about the Mongols. They'd been studying Japan for years, sending merchants who were also spies, mapping coastlines, identifying harbors, learning which lords controlled which territories and how those lords felt about the central government. By the time the fleet sailed, Kublai Khan probably knew more about Japanese politics than most Japanese nobles did. Sukekuni knew the Mongols existed. He knew they'd conquered Korea. He might have heard stories about the letters demanding submission, the ones the court in Kyoto had ignored. But he didn't know their order of battle, their standard tactics, their weapons capabilities. He didn't know about the bombs. He didn't know about the coordinated volley fire. He didn't know that challenging a Mongol champion to single combat was like challenging a tsunami to a swimming race. He was about to learn all of it at once, in about 2 hours. And then he was going to be dead. The fleet that appeared off Tsushima had been building for nearly a decade. Not the ships themselves. Those had been constructed in a frantic year of forced labor, but the capability behind them. Kublai Khan had spent the 1260s conquering the southern Song dynasty's naval forces, absorbing their shipwrights, their admirals, their centuries of accumulated knowledge about building vessels that could survive open ocean. The Mongols had started as steppe cavalry who'd never seen the sea. Within a generation, they controlled the most powerful navy in Asia. This is what empire looked like at scale. Not just soldiers, but systems. Not just conquest, but integration. Every people the Mongols defeated became a resource for defeating the next one. Persian siege engineers helped breach Chinese walls. Chinese bureaucrats helped administer Persian cities. Korean shipyards built invasion fleets that Korean sailors would crew and Korean soldiers would fill. The empire didn't just grow, it compounded. And at the center of it sat Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And he was angry about a letter. Forget the Marco Polo fantasy. Forget the image of the cultured emperor, the patron of arts, the curious cosmopolitan who welcomed foreigners and debated philosophy. All of that was true, and none of it mattered when his authority was challenged. Kublai Khan had killed more people than the Black Death. He'd ordered the annihilation of cities that had resisted his grandfather's armies decades earlier, just to prove that Mongol memory was longer than human lifespans. He'd watched his own brothers tear the empire apart in civil war and emerged as the sole survivor, the one Khan who'd outmaneuvered, outfought, and outlived all the others. This was not a man who tolerated being ignored. The first letter had arrived in Japan in 1268, polite by Mongol standards. It spoke of friendly relations between neighboring states, of trade and mutual benefit, of the natural order that placed the great Khan at the apex of civilization. It also mentioned, almost casually, that states which refused friendship often found themselves experiencing other kinds of attention. The Japanese court read it, understood the threat, and did nothing. Not because they were stupid, but because they were divided, distracted, and constitutionally incapable of responding quickly to anything. The Kamakura shogunate and the imperial court in Kyoto spent months debating who had the authority to reply, what tone the reply should take, whether replying at all might be seen as acknowledging Mongol superiority. By the time they'd finished arguing, the moment had passed. Kublai sent another letter in 1271. Same tone, slightly sharper edges. This time the court at least discussed sending a response. But again, the politics got in the way. And again, the Mongol messengers sailed home with nothing. And in any other context, this might have been the end of it. Empires had better things to do than chase small island nations across inconvenient oceans. But Kublai Khan wasn't any other emperor, and Japan wasn't just any other target. Japan was the country that had refused him twice. Japan was the stain on his record, the one direction his armies hadn't marched, the proof that even the great Khan had limits. He couldn't tolerate that. Not politically, not personally, not strategically. The Mongol system ran on momentum and reputation. Every conquest made the next one easier because potential targets looked at the map and did the math and decided that surrender was cheaper than resistance. But if a target could refuse and survive, if word spread that the Mongols could be defied without consequence, the whole machine would start to wobble. Japan had to be punished. Not because it was valuable, but because it was visible. When Kublai Khan gave the order to build an invasion fleet, he wasn't thinking about Japanese rice or Japanese silver or Japanese trade routes. He was thinking about what a burned Japanese coastline would do to every other vassal state that might be considering defiance. He was thinking about the message. The actual logistics were someone else's problem. Specifically, they were Korea's problem. Kim Bang-gyong stood on the deck of his flagship as it cleared the harbor at Happo, watching the Korean coastline recede behind him, and he was thinking about numbers. 8,000 Korean soldiers under his command, 7,000 Korean sailors crewing the ships, 900 vessels. Almost all of them built in the last 12 months by workers who'd been drafted from their farms and their fishing boats and their families, worked until they collapsed, replaced by others who'd be worked the same way. He was 62 years old. He'd spent the first half of his life fighting the Mongols, watching them burn his country 6 times over, watching them kill millions of his people in campaigns that had lasted 3 decades. He'd seen cities reduced to ash. He'd seen refugees starve on mountain roads. He'd seen what happened to populations that resisted and populations that surrendered, and he'd learned that the difference was mostly timing. Korea had surrendered in 1259 finally, after 30 years of war that had destroyed everything except the stubborn core of the ruling family hiding on an island fortress. The terms were harsh but survivable. Korea would remain nominally independent, governed by its own kings, but those kings would marry Mongol princesses, send tribute to the Khan, and provide military support whenever demanded. This was the demand. Build a fleet, fill it with soldiers, sail to Japan and help us conquer it. Kim hadn't been given a choice. None of them had. When the great Khan told you to invade someone, you invaded them, or you became the someone being invaded. That was the logic of empire, clean and simple and completely inescapable. So here he was, commanding the vanguard of an invasion force that would do to Japan what the Mongols had done to Korea, creating the same horror he'd spent his youth trying to prevent. And there was nothing in his face as the fleet sailed east toward Tsushima, and that suggested he felt anything about it at all. A subordinate approached him that night as the ships anchored in formation, waiting for dawn and the landing. The man was young, new to command, still naive enough to ask questions that had no safe answers. Will they fight? Kim didn't look at him. He looked at the dark mass of the island on the horizon, the place where tomorrow would happen. They'll fight. They always fight at first. and then they'll learn what we learned, and they'll stop. What did Korea learn? That the only thing worse than serving the Khan is refusing him. The subordinate went away. Kim stayed at the rail, watching Tsushima, thinking about nothing he'd ever tell anyone. In the morning, he would give orders that would kill hundreds of Japanese soldiers and thousands of Japanese civilians. He would do it efficiently and professionally, because that was what survival required. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where he kept the memories of burning Korean cities and starving Korean refugees, he would feel something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been grief, or might have been nothing at all. The invasion was never personal for Kim Bang-kyung. It was just the next thing the empire required. An empire doesn't care what you feel while you're being useful. While the Mongol fleet was being assembled in Korea, while Kim Bang-kyung was being briefed on landing zones and garrison strengths, Sō Sukekuni was living the life of a minor noble on an island that didn't matter. Tsushima in the 1260s and early 1270s was a backwater, always had been. The island sat in the strait between Korea and Japan, close enough to both to be strategically relevant in theory, far enough from either to be ignored in practice. Pirates sometimes used it as a base. Traders sometimes stopped there for water. The Sō clan had governed it for generations, collecting modest taxes from modest fishermen, maintaining a modest garrison, sending modest tribute to the shogunate in Kamakura. Sukekuni had been born to this life around 1214, give or take a few years. The sources don't agree on his exact age, but they agree on his station. Deputy military governor, the title that meant he was responsible for defense. On an island where defense meant occasionally chasing off Korean pirates and breaking up fights between fishing villages, this was not a demanding job. He'd trained as a samurai, of course. All nobles did. He could ride, he could shoot. He could handle a sword well enough to satisfy the requirements of his rank. But training and combat are different things, and Sukekuni had spent most of his adult life in the comfortable space between them. He'd probably never killed anyone. He'd certainly never commanded men in a real battle against a real enemy with real stakes. This was not unusual. Japan in the 13th century was at peace with itself, more or less. The great civil wars of the 12th century had settled into a stable if complicated arrangement between the military government in Kamakura and the imperial court in Kyoto. Local disputes happened, border skirmishes flared up, but nothing that would require a 60-year-old island governor to suddenly become a combat commander. The warnings had come, of course. News traveled slowly, but it traveled. The Sukekuni knew that the Mongols had conquered Korea. He knew about the letters demanding submission. He probably knew that the court had ignored them, though he might not have known why, since the reasons were mostly political embarrassment and bureaucratic paralysis. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was what Mongol war actually looked like. The descriptions that filtered through from the continent were vague and contradictory. Huge armies, yes, brutal tactics, certainly, but the specifics, the bombs, the massed volley fire, the coordinated cavalry maneuvers, the psychological warfare, none of that had made it across the water in any useful form. Sukekuni prepared as best he could with the information he had. He maintained his garrison. He kept his weapons in good repair. He probably increased patrols along the coast in the early 1270s when the rumors of invasion started getting more specific. But he was preparing for a version of war he understood, a version where samurai faced samurai and the rules applied and skill and courage determined the outcome. He was preparing for the wrong enemy, and nobody told him because nobody knew. The morning of October 5th, 1274, began like every other morning on Tsushima. Fishermen launching boats, farmers walking to fields, servants preparing food in the governor's household. The ordinary rhythm of ordinary life on an island where nothing extraordinary ever happened. And then the fisherman came running, and everything changed. What went through Sukekuni's mind in those first minutes? The sources don't tell us, and we can only guess. Shock, certainly. The reports were impossible, the numbers absurd. 900 ships would have been the largest fleet in Japanese history. It would have been the largest fleet in Korean history. It was, in fact, the largest fleet that had ever sailed in East Asian waters, and it was anchored off his beach. Fear, probably, though a man like Sukekuni would have called it something else. Concern for his family, his people, his responsibility. The weight of understanding that everything he'd ever been tasked with protecting was now in immediate danger, and he had no resources adequate to the threat. But underneath the shock and the fear, there must have been something else. Something harder to name. The recognition that this was the moment his entire life had been pointing toward, even though he hadn't known it. The understanding that all those years of training, all those years of theoretical preparation were about to be tested in the most absolute way possible. He sent messengers to the mainland. They would arrive too late to matter, but he sent them anyway, because the warning might save someone else, even if it couldn't save Tsushima. He gathered his men, the 80 mounted samurai, and the 200-odd retainers and servants who would fill out his force. He gave orders for civilians to flee into the mountains, though he must have known that not everyone would make it. And then he made the decision that would define him. He could have retreated. The mountains of Tsushima were rough terrain, defensible, places where a small force might hold out for days or weeks against a larger enemy. Guerrilla tactics, harassment, and the slow bleeding of an occupying army. It wasn't glorious, but it might have been effective. It might have cost the Mongols time and casualties that would matter when they reached the mainland. He chose the beach instead. We don't know why. Maybe he believed against all evidence that a frontal assault might work, that samurai courage could overcome Mongol numbers. Maybe he thought that dying in open battle was preferable to hiding in caves while his people were slaughtered below. Maybe it was simply instinct, the automatic response of a man who'd spent his whole life being told that honor meant facing your enemy directly. Whatever the odds. A retainer, the sources say, asked him about reinforcements. The mainland could send help. They could hold the mountains and wait. Sukekuni's response was the last thing he said that survived to be recorded. If we don't stop them here, there'll be no one left to reinforce. It wasn't true, strategically speaking. The Mongols weren't going to depopulate the entire island in a single afternoon, and reinforcements might have made a difference if he'd lasted long enough to receive them. But it felt true. It felt like the only truth that mattered in that moment. The ships were here. The enemy was landing. Waiting was the same as surrender, and surrender wasn't something Sō Sukekuni knew how to do. He mounted his horse, his son mounted beside him. Neither spoke about what was coming, because speaking about it would have made it real in a way that couldn't be taken back. The column formed behind them, an 80 samurai in armor that had never been tested against Mongol composite bows, carrying swords that had never met coordinated infantry tactics, riding toward a beach where everything they knew about war was about to become obsolete. The sun was still climbing. They had perhaps an hour before contact. Somewhere out there, across the narrow water, Kim Bang-gyeong was watching the landing craft shuttle soldiers to shore, counting the minutes until his vanguard was fully assembled, thinking about timelines and objectives and the message this island was about to send to the Japanese mainland. two men in their 60s, both warriors, both commanders, both trapped by circumstances they hadn't chosen. One fighting for an empire he served because the alternative was death. One fighting for an island he loved because the alternative was worse than death. They would never meet. They would never speak. But in a few hours, one of them would order the death of the other, and neither would have any choice about it. The pieces were moving into position. The drums had started. The first bombs were being loaded onto catapults. And Sō Sukekuni was riding toward the sound of something he'd never heard before. Something that would end his life before he understood what it was. The Battle of Tsushima was about to begin, and nothing about it would go the way anyone expected. The sun was still low when Sō Sukekuni reached the ridge above Komoda Beach, and what he saw there changed everything he thought he knew about war. The landing was already in progress, so flat-bottomed boats shuttling between the anchored fleet and the shore, each one carrying 20 or 30 soldiers, disgorging them onto the sand and waves. Hundreds of men already formed up on the beach, more arriving every few minutes. Banners going up, unit markers that meant nothing to him, colors and symbols from a military tradition he'd never studied because he'd never imagined he'd need to. He tried to count, stopped, started again. The numbers kept changing because the numbers kept growing, and at some point the specific figure stopped mattering. Whether it was 2,000 or 5,000 or 8,000, the answer was the same. More than he could fight. More than anyone could fight with what he had. His 80 mounted samurai had formed up behind him, waiting for orders. Another 200 men on foot, retainers and servants, and a few farmers who'd grabbed whatever weapons they could find. They were watching him, waiting for him to tell them what to do. And for a long moment, Sukekuni had nothing to give them. Here's what he understood, standing on that ridge in the early morning light. The Mongols had chosen this beach for a reason. Komoda was sheltered from the worst of the autumn winds, with a gradual slope that made landing easy and a wide expanse of flat ground where an army could form up without crowding. The terrain behind the beach rose into hills and forest, which might have offered defensive advantages if he'd had time to prepare positions. He didn't have time. He didn't have positions. He had a ridge and a view and a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. If he attacked now, while the landing was still in progress, he might catch them disorganized. Some of the boats were still in the water. Some units were still forming. There was a window, narrow and closing fast, when his cavalry might do real damage before the Mongol numbers became overwhelming. If he waited, the window would close. The landing would complete. The Mongol force would consolidate, organize, and then move inland with the kind of coordinated precision he'd heard about in stories, but never witnessed. His 300 men would be facing a fully deployed army with supply lines stretching back to 900 ships, and the mathematics of that scenario had only one outcome. He chose to attack. Not because he thought he could win, but because attacking was the only action available that didn't feel like surrender. The order went down the line. Prepare to advance. The samurai checked their bows, counted their arrows, tightened the straps on their armor. A few of them murmured prayers. Most of them just looked at the beach below and did the same calculation Sukekuni had done and came to the same conclusion and said nothing about it. Sukekuni's son was beside him, young enough to still believe that courage might matter, old enough to understand that it probably wouldn't. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make the next hour harder than it was already going to be. What Sukekuni didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the landing below wasn't disorganized at all. It only looked that way from the ridge. The Mongol military machine had been perfecting amphibious operations for years, absorbing Chinese naval expertise, drilling Korean crews, while working out the logistics of moving thousands of men from ship to shore without the chaos that usually accompanied such maneuvers. What looked like confusion was actually choreography. What looked like a window was actually a trap. Kim Bang-gyong had anticipated exactly this response. A local garrison commander, outnumbered and outgunned, watching the landing from high ground and deciding that a quick strike might catch the invaders off balance. It was the rational choice. It was the brave choice. It was also the choice that would funnel Sukekuni's cavalry directly into prepared killing zones. The Korean general had positioned his best archers at the flanks, hidden behind the initial landing parties, ready to catch any attacking force in crossfire. He'd placed his bomb teams near the center, where the charge would be most concentrated. He'd kept his heavy infantry in reserve, fresh and ready to exploit whatever chaos the first volleys created. The beach at Komoda wasn't just a landing zone. It was a stage, and the performance had been rehearsed before Sukekuni ever saw his first Mongol sail. This was the gap that would kill him. Not courage, not numbers, not even technology. Information. Kim Bang-gyong knew exactly how samurai warfare worked. He'd been briefed by traders, by spies, by Korean nobles who dealt with Japanese merchants for generations. He knew about the challenges, the individual combat, the emphasis on personal glory. He knew that Japanese cavalry would charge directly at the center of the formation, because that's where the most prestigious targets were, because that's where honor demanded they go. He'd built his entire defensive scheme around that knowledge. The center was a killing funnel. The prestigious targets were bait. Sukekuni knew none of this. He saw a beach, an enemy, and a window. He gave the order to advance. The column began moving down from the ridge, picking its way through the scrubland toward the more open ground near the shore. At the front rode Sukekuni and his son and the senior retainers, the men whose rank demanded they lead. Behind them came the rest of the mounted samurai, arranged by clan and family, each man carrying the weight of ancestors who expected him to perform. At the rear came the foot soldiers, moving as fast as they could, knowing they'd arrive after the cavalry had already made contact. The drums started before they reached level ground. It was a sound unlike anything Sukekuni had heard before, not the battle drums of Japanese warfare, which were used for signaling and coordination. This was something else entirely. A low, constant pulse that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the air and the ground, making the horses nervous, making the men grip their weapons tighter without knowing why. Psychological warfare. The Mongols had been using it for 60 years, perfecting the frequencies and rhythms that most effectively unsettled enemy formations. They'd learned that battle started before the first arrow flew, that an army already trembling was an army half defeated. The drums were a weapon, and they were aimed directly at Sukekuni's nerve. He kept moving. The alternative was stopping, and stopping was the same as running, and running wasn't something he could make himself do. The drums got louder. The beach got closer. The Mongol formation resolved from a mass of movement into something more structured, units visible now, ranks forming, a machine assembling itself from components. Takazaki Suinaga would later paint this moment in his famous scroll, the one he commissioned to petition for rewards after the war. In the painting, the Japanese charge looks almost orderly, banners flying, horses in formation, samurai riding toward destiny with the kind of composed determination that makes good propaganda. The reality was messier. Horses shying from the drums, men bunching up on the uneven ground, the formation stretching and compressing as different riders moved at different speeds. By the time the Japanese force reached the flat ground near the beach, they were already more ragged than they should have been, and the first samurai was already riding forward to issue his challenge. This was the ritual. the part that was supposed to happen. A champion advanced ahead of the line, shouted his name and lineage to the enemy, and waited for a response. It was theater and religion and military protocol all at once, a way of establishing the terms of engagement, of transforming mass violence into something with rules and meaning. The champion was a man named Sato, or so the fragments of surviving records suggest. He was young, well-armored, mounted on a horse that had probably cost more than most peasants earned in a lifetime. He rode forward with the confidence of someone who had trained for this moment since childhood, who knew exactly what was supposed to happen next. He shouted his name. He announced his lineage. He issued his challenge. But the Mongol line did not stop. No one answered. The drums just kept pounding, steady and mechanical. And for a long moment, Sato sat there on his horse, waiting for a response that wasn't coming, his entire understanding of warfare collapsing in real time. Then the arrows came. Not one arrow, not a challenge shot. Hundreds of arrows, fired in coordinated volleys from positions Sato hadn't even noticed, converging on him from multiple angles. His horse went down first, screaming, legs folding. He hit the ground hard, tried to rise, and took 3 more arrows before he could get his feet under him. The whole thing took maybe 15 seconds. Sukekuni watched his man die without ever reaching the enemy line. He watched the body twitch and go still. He watched the Mongol formation continue its work, loaders already knocking new arrows, the rhythm unbroken. And he understood, in that moment, that everything he knew about war was obsolete. But understanding didn't change anything. The charge was already in motion. His men were already committed. Stopping now would mean standing still under arrow fire until everyone was dead. The only direction that offered any chance at all was forward. He raised his sword. He gave the order. The samurai charged. What happened next would become legend, eventually, distorted and polished until it sounded like something other than what it was. The brave stand at Komoda, the first clash between samurai and Mongol, the moment Japanese steel met continental iron. The truth was uglier than legend. The truth was chaos and noise and men dying in ways they'd never imagined, cut down before they could close to fighting distance, their horses panicking and throwing them, their formations dissolving under the weight of coordinated fire. The truth was, the first bomb landing in the middle of the Japanese line and the explosion that followed, the sound like nothing anyone had heard, the smoke and the screaming horses, and the men staggering blind. Sukekuni kept moving forward because forward was the only option left. His banner was still up. His son was still beside him, or had been a moment ago, somewhere in the smoke. The drums were louder now, or maybe they just seemed louder because everything else had become noise and confusion. He saw Mongol soldiers for the first time at close range. Not the massed formation, but individual men, faces visible, weapons raised. Short swords, not the long curved blades of samurai tradition. Armor that looked different, unmoved different. Eyes that showed no fear, because why would they fear a single old man on a dying horse when they had thousands of friends behind them? The moment of contact, when Sukekuni finally reached the enemy line, lasted perhaps 30 seconds. The sources don't tell us what happened in those seconds. They don't tell us who he killed, if he killed anyone. They don't tell us when exactly his horse went down, or how long he fought on foot, or what his final words were. They tell us only that he died at Komoda, fighting, and that his body was never recovered. His son died somewhere nearby. Same silence in the records, same absence of detail. The battle didn't produce witnesses who survived to testify about individual heroics. It produced a mass grave and a conquered island, and stories that would grow larger with each retelling until they barely resembled what had actually happened on that beach. What actually happened was this. The Japanese charge broke against the Mongol line like water against a seawall. The few samurai who reached close combat found themselves surrounded, cut off, pulled down by numbers. The bombs kept falling, the arrows kept flying, the drums kept pounding. Within an hour, maybe less, there was no organized Japanese resistance left on the beach at Komoda. Kim Bang-gyong watched from his position near the center of the formation, tracking the battle's progress with the detachment of a man who had seen all of this before. The Japanese had done exactly what he'd expected them to do. They'd charged the center, and they'd tried to fight as individuals against a system designed to process individuals. They'd died. A subordinate approached with a question about prisoners. There were wounded samurai on the field, men who might survive if treated. What should be done with them? Kim's answer was brief. Make sure the ones who live can tell the story. This was the message. This was what Tsushima was for. Not the island itself, not its fish or its timber or its strategic position. The message, the demonstration, the proof that Japanese warriors, the legendary samurai, could be slaughtered like cattle by an army that didn't care about their names or their lineages or their challenges. The survivors would carry that message to the mainland. They would describe the drums and the bombs and the arrows that fell like rain. They would describe champions cut down before they could finish speaking, formations dissolved by weapons they'd never seen, an enemy that fought without honor because honor was a luxury, and the Mongols couldn't afford luxuries. That message was worth more than Tsushima. That message was worth more than all of Sukekuni's 80 samurai and all of his 200-foot soldiers combined. That message would travel faster than any ship, would spread through Japan like fire through dry grass, would change the way an entire civilization thought about war. The beach at Komoda was silent by midday. The bodies hadn't been cleared yet, wouldn't be cleared for hours, left there as a statement for anyone watching from the hills. The Mongol force was already reorganizing, preparing to move inland, to sweep the island for any remaining resistance. There wouldn't be much. A few dozen fighters hiding in the mountains maybe, civilians who hadn't fled fast enough, nothing that would slow the timetable. Sukekuni's banner lay in the sand near where his horse had fallen. Someone would pick it up later, would send it back to the mainland as a trophy or a warning. For now it just lay there, cloth and wood, the symbol of an authority that no longer existed because the man who'd carried it no longer existed. This wasn't a battle. It was a proof of concept. The Mongols had tested their invasion doctrine against Japanese defense doctrine, and Japanese defense doctrine had failed in every conceivable way. Now they knew. Now they had data. Now they could move to the next phase with confidence. Iki would be next. Then the mainland. The machine was working. But something else was happening too. Something the Mongols hadn't planned for and couldn't have anticipated. The survivors who fled Komoda Beach, the fishermen and farmers and servants who'd watched from the hills, they weren't just carriers of terror. They were carriers of information, incomplete, distorted, filtered through panic and grief, but information nonetheless. They'd seen the bombs, they'd heard the drums, they'd watched the massed volleys shred a cavalry charge before it reached the enemy line, and as they fled toward boats that would carry them to the mainland, as they screamed their warnings to anyone who would listen, they were giving Japan something it had never had before, a preview. The samurai who would face the Mongols at Hakata Bay in 2 weeks wouldn't be fighting blind the way Sukekuni had. They wouldn't ride forward expecting challenges and individual combat. They would know, at least in general terms, what was coming. They would have time, however little, to think about how to respond. Sukekuni's death bought that. Not deliberately, not strategically, but in the only way death ever buys anything, by being the first one to pay the price. The Mongol fleet raised anchor the next morning, leaving a garrison behind to secure the island. 900 ships turning east toward Iki, toward the next demonstration, toward the mainland beyond. The drums had stopped. The silence that followed was worse. On the beach at Komoda, the tide was coming in. By evening it would wash over the bodies, would begin the slow work of erasing the evidence of what had happened there. By the following year, there would be nothing left to mark the spot where Sō Sukekuni had made his stand. No monument, no memorial, just sand and water and the indifferent rhythm of waves that had been breaking on that shore for 10,000 years and would continue breaking for 10,000 more. The battle was over. The war was just beginning. And in Kamakura, 1,500 miles to the east, an 18-year-old regent named Hojo Tokimune was about to receive news that would transform him from a boy administrator into a war leader. The message from Tsushima would reach him in days. The question of what to do about it would define the rest of his life. The Mongol fleet sailed on, confident, efficient, unstoppable. They had every reason to believe the rest of the invasion would proceed exactly as Tsushima had. They had every reason to believe Japan would fall the way Korea had fallen, the way China was falling, the way every other target had fallen when the empire turned its attention their way. They were wrong, but they wouldn't learn that for another 2 weeks. And by then, a lot more people would be dead. The Mongol fleet sailed away from Hakata Bay on the night of October 20th, 1274, and for a long moment, the samurai standing on the beach didn't know what to make of it. They'd been fighting for less than 24 hours. The losses had been brutal, the chaos overwhelming, the bombs and the drums and the massed arrow fire, everything the survivors from Tsushima had warned them about. But they'd held. Somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they'd held. The wall of ships that had seemed infinite that morning was now moving away, lanterns receding into darkness, the sound of drums fading until there was nothing left but waves and wind and the groans of wounded men. Had they won? The honest answer was no. The Mongols hadn't been defeated. They'd withdrawn. The difference matters more than most people realize. A defeated army is broken, scattered, incapable of returning. A withdrawn army is intact, organized, choosing to leave for reasons that have nothing to do with the enemy's strength. The fleet sailing back toward Korea still had most of its ships, most of its soldiers, most of its capability. Whatever had prompted the retreat, it wasn't Japanese military prowess. The sources don't agree on why the Mongols left. Korean records cite depleted arrows and high casualties, particularly among officers. As some mention disputes between the Mongol and Korean commanders about whether to push forward or consolidate. Others point to the season, the approaching winter storms that made extended naval operations dangerous. The deputy commander, Liu Fuheng, had taken an arrow to the face during the fighting, which might have affected decision-making at the top. Japanese sources, predictably, credit divine intervention. The gods had protected the sacred islands. The spirits of Ise had turned back the barbarian horde. This narrative would grow larger over the following years, would eventually crystallize into the concept of Kamikaze, the divine wind, Japan as a nation, specially protected by forces beyond human understanding. The truth was probably simpler and uglier. The 1274 invasion may never have been intended as a conquest at all. One, it may have been exactly what some historians now believe. A reconnaissance in force, a demonstration, a way of testing Japanese defenses and terrifying the population into submission before the real invasion came. If that was the goal, then the operation was a complete success. The Mongols had learned everything they needed to know. The samurai could be beaten. The coastal defenses were inadequate. The next time, they'd bring more men and more ships, and they'd finish the job. But none of that mattered to the men on the beach that night. What mattered was that the ships were leaving. What mattered was that they were still alive. What mattered was that somewhere in the darkness behind them, in the hills and the villages and the roads leading inland, there were families who would see their fathers and sons and brothers again. Sō Sukekuni would not be among them. His family would never see him again. His body lay somewhere on a beach 400 miles to the west, unmarked, unrecovered, already beginning the slow process of becoming soil. His son was with him. His retainers were with him. Everyone who had ridden down that ridge at Komoda was gone, erased so completely that we don't even know most of their names. The cost of being first is that no one remembers you were paying it, while everyone else was still deciding whether to show up. The 7 years that followed transformed Japan in ways that would have been unimaginable before the invasion. The Kamakura shogunate, which had spent decades managing a comfortable peace, suddenly had to become a war government. Resources that had flowed to temples and aristocratic estates now flowed to coastal defenses, and samurai who had trained for individual combat now drilled in formation tactics. An entire civilization that had believed the sea would protect it learned in one brutal autumn that the sea was just water. The most visible evidence of this transformation was the wall. Construction began in 1276, 2 years after the invasion. 20 kilometers of stone fortification ringing Hakata Bay, designed to prevent exactly what had happened at Komoda and Iki, to deny the Mongols the beach landings that had made their tactics so devastating. It was the largest military construction project in Japanese history, built by forced labor from across Kyushu, a monument to fear made solid in rock and mortar. Sō Sukekuni's replacement on Tsushima watched the wall go up from reports, from letters, from the occasional messenger who made the dangerous crossing. The island had been repopulated, garrisoned again, given a new deputy governor whose primary qualification was his willingness to die in exactly the same way Sukekuni had died. Everyone knew Tsushima would be sacrificed again if the Mongols returned. Everyone knew the wall at Hakata wouldn't protect the islands in the strait. The new garrison was there to buy time, to send warnings, to be a speed bump on the road to the mainland. The men stationed there understood their role. They stayed anyway. Someone had to. Hojo Tokimune, the young regent who had received the news of Tsushima with the weight of a man twice his age, spent those 7 years preparing for a war he knew was coming. When Mongol envoys arrived in 1275 demanding submission, he didn't debate. He didn't negotiate. He had them beheaded and their heads displayed on pikes. This was not diplomacy. This was a declaration. Japan would not surrender. Japan would not submit. Japan would fight until there was nothing left to fight with. And if that meant annihilation, then annihilation was preferable to the alternative. Kublai Khan received the news of his executed ambassadors with the kind of cold fury that had ended civilizations. The next invasion wouldn't be a reconnaissance. It wouldn't be a demonstration. It would be an extinction event. The fleet that launched in the summer of 1281 was the largest naval invasion force in human history until D-Day. 4,400 ships, 140,000 men. 2 separate armadas, one from Korea and one from southern China, converging on Japan in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm any possible defense. Tsushima fell again. Iki fell again. The same beaches, the same impossible odds, the same slaughter. New deputies died the same way Sukekuni had died, buying hours with their lives, sending warnings that traveled faster than any fleet. But this time, the mainland was ready. The wall at Hakata held. The Mongol landing craft couldn't beach properly against the stone fortifications. The samurai who met them had learned from 1274, had studied the reports, had trained for this specific enemy. They didn't ride forward to issue challenges. They fought in groups, targeted officers, launched night raids against anchored ships with small boats and fire arrows. For 6 weeks, the invasion stalled at the beaches, unable to break through, unable to establish the foothold that would let their superior numbers tell. And then the storm came. August 15th and 16th, 1281. A typhoon of extraordinary power struck Hakata Bay, catching the Mongol fleet at anchor, destroying ships by the hundreds, drowning men by the tens of thousands. When the wind finally stopped, the invasion was over. Not defeated by Japanese steel, but shattered by Japanese weather, the divine wind, the Kamikaze, the storm that saved Japan. Here's the irony that history loves to bury. The Kamikaze gets the credit, but the Kamikaze didn't save an unprepared Japan. It saved a Japan that had been fighting for 6 weeks, that had held the line with walls and raids and the hard lessons learned from Sukekuni's death. If the samurai had broken at Hakata, if the wall hadn't held, the fleet would have been safely dispersed across Japanese harbors when the storm hit. And the divine wind needed human beings to keep the enemy in the water long enough for weather to matter. So Sukekuni bought 2 hours at Komoda. The samurai at Hakata bought 6 weeks. The typhoon bought everything else. But the story we tell only remembers the last part, the miraculous intervention, the gods reaching down to protect their chosen islands. The human cost gets lost in the divine narrative. This is how history works. The dramatic ending overwrites the painful middle. The spectacular finish erases the ordinary people who made it possible. The aftermath of 1281 should have been a moment of triumph for Japan. The greatest empire in history had thrown everything it had at the sacred islands, and the sacred islands had survived. Divine favor was confirmed. National identity was crystallized, and the samurai had proven themselves against the most fearsome enemy the world had ever produced. Instead, it was a catastrophe. The problem was money. The Mongol invasions had cost an enormous amount to resist. The wall, the mobilization, the naval construction, the 7 years of constant military preparedness, all of it had drained the treasury dry. In a normal war, victory meant plunder, meant conquered territory, meant resources flowing back to reward the warriors who had risked their lives. But Japan hadn't conquered anything. Japan had defended its own beaches. There was no plunder. There were no new lands to distribute. And the samurai who had fought at Hakata, who had lost brothers and sons and retainers in the grinding defensive battle, came home expecting rewards that didn't exist. The shogunate tried to pay them anyway, and distributing what little it had, making promises it couldn't keep. It wasn't enough. The warriors who had saved Japan spent the following decades suing each other, petitioning the government, nursing grievances that would eventually tear the political system apart. Takazaki Suenaga, the samurai whose painted scroll preserves the only visual record of the 1274 fighting, commissioned that scroll specifically to support his petition for rewards. He'd charged a Mongol position, taken wounds, lost his horse, kept fighting. The scroll shows all of it in vivid detail: bombs exploding, arrows flying, Suenaga bleeding, but unbowed. It's propaganda, but it's propaganda created by a man who felt cheated by the government he'd bled for. He eventually received a modest land grant. Most of his comrades received less or nothing. The system that had held together against the Mongol threat began to fracture under the weight of debts it couldn't pay. Within 50 years, the Kamakura shogunate would collapse entirely, replaced by a new government that rose on the grievances of unpaid warriors. The invasion that didn't conquer Japan destroyed Japan anyway, just slower. And Tsushima? The island that had paid the first price, that had contributed bodies and blood in Sukekuni's impossible stand? Tsushima got a shrine. The memorial to Sō Sukekuni exists today on the island, a modest Shinto structure near the site where he probably died. Tourists visit sometimes, the ones who've read enough history to know the name, who've come looking for traces of the famous stand. They find stone monuments, incense burners, the quiet persistence of memory in a culture that values such things. What they don't find is grandeur. They don't find the kind of elaborate commemoration that nations build for their defining heroes. Sukekuni's memorial is proportional to his importance in the story Japan tells about itself, which is to say, marginal. He's a footnote, the first line in a narrative that nobody starts at the beginning. The beach at Komoda looks the same as it did 750 years ago. The same sand, the same water, the same hills rising behind the shore. If you stand there at dawn, you can imagine what Sukekuni saw when he crested that ridge. The horizon thick with masts, the sea turned solid with ships. You can imagine the weight of that moment, the calculation he made, the decision that sent him riding toward an enemy he couldn't defeat. You can imagine it, but you can't feel it. The terror is gone. The drums are silent. The ships are gone. All that remains is the story, and the story has been polished smooth by centuries of retelling, turned into something that sounds like honor, when it was actually just a man doing the only thing he knew how to do when everything else had failed. The Mongol Empire never invaded Japan again. Kublai Khan planned a third attempt, ordered the construction of new fleets, made the conquest of Japan a personal obsession that consumed the last years of his reign. He died in 1294 without seeing it happen. His successors had other problems, internal rebellions, succession crises, the slow fragmentation of an empire too large to hold together. Japan slipped off the agenda. The sacred islands remained sacred, being protected by divine wind and the convenient death of the man who most wanted to destroy them. History has a sense of humor, but it's rarely the kind that makes you laugh. Kim Bang-gyeong, the Korean general who had commanded the vanguard at Tsushima, survived both invasions. He went home to a country that had been devastated by the shipbuilding demands, the troop levies, the resources extracted to support wars that benefited only the Mongol overlords. Korea remained a vassal state for another century, gradually recovering, gradually forgetting, eventually outlasting the empire that had conquered it. Kim died in 1300, aged 88, having spent the second half of his life serving masters he'd spent the first half fighting. His tomb exists in Korea today. Historians debate his legacy, whether he was a collaborator or a survivor, whether serving the conquerors was treason or pragmatism. The debates miss the point. Kim Bang-gyeong didn't choose his circumstances. He chose how to survive them. That's all any of us get to choose. The last Mongol veteran of the 1274 invasion probably died sometime in the 1330s or 1340s. An old man in a world that had moved on, carrying memories of a beach in Japan where everything had worked exactly as planned. He might have told stories to grandchildren who didn't care, might have tried to explain what it felt like to watch a samurai charge dissolve under coordinated arrow fire, to hear the bombs land, to know that you were part of something unprecedented. Or maybe he never talked about it at all. Maybe he just lived out his years in silence, keeping Tsushima in a private place where no one else could see. The 1274 invasion is not well known outside Japan. It's overshadowed by the 1281 invasion, by the Kamikaze, by the drama of a typhoon destroying an armada. The Battle of Tsushima in 1274 gets confused with the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when Japanese warships destroyed the Russian fleet in the same waters 7 centuries later, completing a different kind of transformation. Sukekuni's stand doesn't fit neatly into any of the narratives that nations like to tell. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a strategic success. It wasn't a turning point that changed the course of the war. It was just a man dying badly on a beach because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. That's not a story that sells merchandise. That's not a story that inspires children. That's just history. Ugly and honest and ultimately pointless except for the meaning we choose to give it. But here's the thing about meaning. We don't get to choose whether to give it. We only get to choose what kind. So Sukekuni held a beach for 2 hours against the largest empire in human history. It cost him everything. It accomplished almost nothing in material terms. The Mongols barely noticed. The invasion proceeded on schedule. The timeline didn't shift by a single day. And yet, someone had to be first. Someone had to stand on that ridge, see the ships, do the math, and ride down anyway. Someone had to demonstrate that Japan would fight, that the sacred islands would not simply surrender, that conquest would cost more than a few diplomatic letters and a show of force. Sukekuni didn't know he was sending a message. He didn't know that the survivors who escaped Komoda would carry stories that would galvanize the mainland. He didn't know that his death would become part of a chain of decisions that would eventually lead to a wall, and a defense, and a storm. He just knew the ships were there and someone had to meet them. That's not strategy. That's not tactics. That's something older and simpler. The thing that makes human beings willing to pay prices they can't afford for outcomes they won't live to see. Call it honor, call it duty, call it the refusal to let mathematics dictate the terms of your own extinction. Call it whatever you want. It's the thing that separates resistance from surrender, even when resistance is doomed. The beach at Komoda is quiet now. Has been quiet for 750 years. Except for the waves and the wind and the occasional tourist who wanders down to see where it happened. The sand is the same sand. The water is the same water. The horizon is empty, the way horizons are supposed to be. And if you didn't know the history, you'd never guess that this was where everything changed. But everything did change, not because of what happened on the beach, but because of what didn't happen afterward. Japan didn't surrender. Japan didn't submit. Japan didn't become another province of an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary. The Mongols came twice, and twice they failed. And however much credit belongs to the Kamikaze, some of it belongs to the men who bought the time for the win to matter. Sukekuni didn't know any of that. He just knew the ships were there. That fisherman, on the one who dropped his nets when the horizon disappeared, probably survived. The sources don't tell us his name or his fate, but fishermen knew how to disappear when danger appeared, knew the hidden coves and the mountain paths, knew how to wait out the storms that periodically swept their lives clean. He probably lived through the occupation, through the terror, through the departure of the fleet. He probably went back to his nets eventually, pulled them from the same waters where he'd stood that morning when the world changed. And every dawn for the rest of his life, he probably looked at the horizon first, just to make sure it was still empty, just to make sure the sea was still the sea and not a forest of masts waiting to swallow everything he'd ever known. That's what survival costs, not just the dying, but the living with what you've seen. The ships are gone now. The empire is gone. The bones are gone. 750 years have passed, and Tsushima is a quiet island at the edge of two countries, visited by tourists who come to see the memorials and the beaches and the places where history happened to people whose names have mostly been forgotten. Sō Sukekuni's shrine still stands. Incense still burns there. Someone was there today, probably, leaving offerings for a man who died before anyone understood what he was dying for. He held a beach for 2 hours. It cost him everything. It accomplished almost nothing. And 750 years later, we're still talking about it. Because sometimes, the only victory available is the refusal to stop fighting. Because sometimes, losing well is the only kind of winning that matters. Because sometimes, the most important thing a person can do is stand on a ridge, see the impossible, and ride down to meet it anyway. That's not a lesson nations teach. That's not a story empires tell. That's just a man on a beach, doing the only thing he knew how to do, paying a price he couldn't afford for an outcome he wouldn't live to see. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. He did it anyway. If you made it this far, you understand something most people never learn, that history's real heroes aren't the ones who won. They're the ones who showed up when winning wasn't possible. So tell me in the comments, who's the Sukekuni in your history, the one who paid the price that everyone else forgot? And if you want to see the second invasion, the wall, and the storm that finally ended it all, that video is coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it.